in contact with the Yunzhou collection. The Yunzhou collection is really quite impressive. It's a remarkable and one of a kind, but it also is not in a vacuum. And we have to look at it with let's look at it with larger trends and larger frameworks and what it can do to our larger understanding of the history of Chinese medicine. And just as significantly, we have to question ourselves its relationship to the state, because it fundamentally is not a collection which one would think would perhaps belong to the history of the state, because it's a series of manuscripts that belong to these practitioners, and they use it to talk to themselves essentially. But it does have a connection with the state, and it has a connection to the state for many reasons. But one of them is through military medicine. All right, now that's kind of the basics of this right here, and I'll just start with scholarship has documented a process of discursive and institutional medical retrenchment in early modern China, culminating in the Qing period. Independent-minded and status-seeking unemployed surplus civil servant licentiates were offloaded into the publishing and medical industries, while the state itself extracted medical knowledge from universal natural history and moral learning. Manchu conquest completed the liquidation of state medical welfare institutions while outsourcing medical services to private charitable institutions. The state's relationship to disease was mostly reactive, and the health of the population was no longer considered a social domain which the state prioritized dictating to, or at least to the extent that it was before in the Song. I claim that with the addition of neglected military administrative sources, we can recover ways which the Qing state arrested medical retrenchment. At the institutional level, the state underwrote a drug entitlement for its soldiers, channeling surpluses in emerging pharmaceutical markets towards them. At the discursive level, the state expanded the public profile of the cross-section of formulas distributed to soldiers by increasing their incidence in medical literature. As a minor claim, I argue that military medical sources carry methodological consequences. They can sharpen our understanding of macro trends in the state's comprehensive relationship to the medical sector, but at the same time, the complex reality of manifold soldierly drug use makes interpretative methods of theorizing specific historical usage more difficult, usages of drugs. Military medicine was in some regards an extension of its own court movement. Its top medical agency supervised both the regular bureaucracy's procurement of medical resources for soldiers and the traditional imperial honorary drug conferral system. As originally conceived by Sari-era Qianlong, this use of court medical medicine for extended purposes beyond healing the emperor and his entourage is referred to as imperial medicine. It is by Sari-era Qianlong, a model which fits in military medicine. The sources in this study are Chinese and Manchu. Many are Ministry of Revenue memorials from that's the Hubu, from the mid-18th to the early 19th centuries, documenting expense audits of counter-rebellion deployments, campaigning and military colonization in Xinjiang, or unclear circumstances. These audits can itemize drugs by name, list their expense, total mass, and origins and destinations. Other sources are palace memorials, processed by the Grand Council, the Zhengjichu, which attach receipts documenting, quantifying, and contextualizing pre-prepared formula sent to soldiers and generals. Further context comes from medical texts, for which a long-term analysis of the textual trends of these formulas is possible against a design control group, which will have bearing on the unsold collection. We're going to get to that control group, but let's first. This is I got some thick slides at first, and I apologize for that. I got to put in a little bit, but it's going to get a little bit thinner. First couple slides. So how did the government get drugs to soldiers? Soldiers drug into. Okay. The processes behind execution of Qing military medical services, particularly drug distribution, constituted an entitlement plan and contained many of the conventionally understood. First, drug distribution was continuous and widespread in any context that Qing applied military power. Prior to the 1780s, military drug procurement in any engagement involved informal procedure by sub-provincial officials, yet was responsive even in the heat of maneuvers. In 1758, procurement of drugs to Bali Xinjiang engaged a military supply field office, a banner vice commander, and Gansu's provincial administration commissioner to draw drugs from Baolan near Lanzhou. A grain produce supervisor further east in Xi'an was also tapped to search for more drugs, all to outfit a single brigade commander commanding no more than 50. Distribution was institutionalized over time. The Qing persisted with a localized strategy, as it was possible to rely on the empire's network market system to move drugs across many different physical and bureaucratic channels. However, after the fiscal disaster of the Second Xinjiang War in the 1770s, the court pushed through cost-saving administrative reforms. The 1785 product was the War Expenditures Regulations, the Jiaqing. The regulations both affirmed the existing practice of on-site procurement at the sub-provincial level, while standardizing procedures at the provincial level, allowing the central government to use the Imperial Medical Bureau, the Taiyuan, to supervise price checking with the Ministry of Revenue, the Hubu, which maintained direct contact with various senior provincial officials. Quantities were possibly broadly standardized. Both origins and destinations for the drugs were listed in documents, beginning typically in provincial capital, such as the 1798 Hunan delivery from Changsha to Shanbak, to specific counties in the northwest of the province. The county names were likely referred to their normal green standard garrisons, as drugs traveling to ad hoc military deployments were typically specified, which in this case were vague Miao borderlands garrisons, as they called them, and the Manchu firearms capital brigade brought into the region. Taking the total drug mass of each delivery and dividing it with the garrison contingents for each county, which are conventionally listed in their respective designations. A consistent range of a drug ratio per soldier emerges, no less than 1/3 to no more than 4/5 of a kilogram per soldier. This rate is ergonomic for a soldier on the move, implying that officials calculated normative distribution targets by the nominal contingents in counties. Local military procurement and distribution was supplemented via the imperial conferral system, sanctifying it with imperial prestige, which also reinforced its normativity. Though drug distribution was performed at distance from the capital, traditional honorary imperial conferral system bolstered the local procurement process with dovetailing mass distribution of soldiers or drugs to soldiers with individual scale honorary conferrals to favored officials and generals. Imperial control was in Taiwan, though typically targeted at Mongolia and Xinjiang. Documents also show supplies flowing to as far north and east as Jilin and Heniantang and as far south as Sichuan. Soldiers' drugs were a material benefit underwritten by the wider economy. Pre-prepared formulas dominated imperial conferral, and the Tongrentang's formulas dominated those which appeared. 47 of this study's 95 formulas appeared on the 1889 Tongrentang pharmacies catalog. We'll talk about the Tongrentang later. It's very important. This strongly suggests favoritism on the part of the court for specific firms, but it also suggests that acquisition could be an open bidding process. The entire bulk pharmaceutical industry was eligible to compete for military distribution. Medical orthodoxy had little purchase in conferral formula systems, making the practice loosely bound with ideology. Only 21 of the 94 drugs appear in the Golden Era. Only 35 even appear in any work of imperial orthodoxy, pretense the court briefly tried to maintain. During the Second Xinjiang War, the court tried to demand that all locally prepared formula earmarked for military use be taken, quote, from the ancient formulas contained in the Golden Mirror. This was belied by the court's own distribution and consumption patterns. 32 of the military formulas from archival sources have records of court use at some point between the beginning of the Kangxi and the end of the Guangxu period, while also never appearing in the Golden Mirror. 11 formulas make no appearance at all in any database I consulted. We will talk about those later. Barely visible in high-profile medical literature. The court could easily distribute highly obscure formulas disassociated from mainstream medical literature, while affording soldiers the exact same expedient relationship to orthodoxy they had themselves. What specific medical assets did soldiers have at their disposal? What kind of therapeutics were they used for? And can we even know based on evidence? The drug entitlement was tied to advanced medical needs. Local procurement documents sometimes itemize diverse variety of drugs. An 1800 audit covers a delivery in Guizhou, Anshun and Xingyi prefectures in Guiyang, with 26 different drugs, some very specialized such as human placenta and rhinoceros horn, and others traditionally originating from far off to the north or southern coasts like Sika stagnant or milkwood, enabling the mixing of varieties of pumpkin formulas. Physicians were even dispatched to assist in this process. The 1798 case in Hunan specifically earmarked funds for physicians, not porters, physicians, to carry the drugs to their destinations. And this is not speculative. The prior 1758 Bali Kun order to Xinjiang was a response to soldiers' demand for replenishment of uneven dwindling of supplies, as they were making specific formulas from targeted cross-sections of ingredients, notably the highly regulated ginseng, which they needed to help mix the formula sangrus. The soldiers pursued it so vigorously that they substituted other ingredients to account for the missing ginseng rather than pursue another formula. There were also outstanding requests for convolvulus, dung beetle, refined calomel, and other more obscure drugs, which prompted a search in Xi'an over 2,000 kilometers away. This was all while these few hundred soldiers were on the move. Qing soldiers drove the demand for drugs as much as the state. Now, in this next section, I propose that using interpolative methods of medicinal use from medical literature is a flawed concept, in that any inspection of state archival material can just as easily disconfirm what medical literature has to say about a drug as it can confirm it. Upon engaging the untold collection, which is composed of manuscripts which private practitioners would have used for their own purposes, without regard for wider circulation and reprint, it has become clear that medical discourse, even pharmaceutical discourse, operated at two levels quite autonomously. A collective, discursive level, governed by published medical texts, both classical and controversial, and two, the practical level. Practitioners' personal notes and handbooks not intended for wider readership operated on a more personalized and microsocial level. It is premature to me to conclude that this latter level was more indicative of real practice, but the distinction and mutual autonomy between the two is very real when coming to military formulas and medical manuscripts. Asking what the effects of military medicine were on medical discourse at either level is tantamount to interrogating the relationship between the Qing state and medicine at large. So far as I have gone over, the scholarly consensus has been that though the Qing engaged in a number of medically relevant projects, and several of the early Qing emperors were medical dilettantes, medicine in the Qing was supposedly laissez-faire, with the state and the medical sector becoming disjointed. I have already gone over how the state funded medical welfare of soldiers, or a form of welfare. But the question remains as to whether or not this sustained practice had any effect on medical discourse. When it comes to the kinds of drugs by the Qing military, used by the Qing military, most Qing scholars would suggest that the principal drivers of the popularity of pre-prepared drugs in Qing China were the major bulk pharmaceutical firms, the most significant being the Tongrentang. This is a question which can be tested, especially now that we know which drugs definitely were consumed by Qing soldiers, Manchu and Han Chinese. The fundamental problem is that, as we will see, drugs which are distributed or sold by either or both pharmaceuticals and the state could be completely invisible in the mainstream medical literature for all of pre-modern Chinese history, yet still enormously popular in the practical literature and just seriously popular at court. This study attempts to straighten out some of these issues. By tracing the incidence of medical formulas in medical literature large across time in China, we can create a useful index for how likely a drug was to expand in its published profile over time. When comparing variable and control groups, it can be possible to isolate the multiplier effect Qing military distribution had on the drugs they selected. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain my methodology a little bit. Over right here. Yeah, so we have this fundamental issue that chengyao, as they are called, and a lot of the drugs which are, in fact, almost exclusively the drugs which were distributed via the imperial conferral process were chengyao, pre-prepared formulas, pre-prepared medicines. The problem is that they were enormously popular and profitable. These both pharmaceutical companies made fortunes off of these things. But at the same time, many of them can also be completely invisible in medical literature. Yet at the same time, as I look at the original text, that can be incredibly popular in these physical texts, these underlying texts that practitioners use. And of these books, pharmaceutical firms, I really wanted to kind of I'll give you a little bit of a brief idea. I mean, it was popular in the most famous sports Tongrentang, there's a Heniantang and Yunintang, and there's a lot, there's a whole lot. It becomes possible to see what they sold and what they expected to sell and what they advertised to people because of their yao, their pharmaceutical catalogs. And recently, a large batch of the Yao Mu, which are kind of difficult to find often, were published by the late Fan Xingjun's scholarly studio. And it became possible to gather a lot. Now, the Tongrentang Yao Mu has been available for a long time, but others such as the Heniantang remain available. And it's going to be possible to take all of these drugs that are on these Yao Mu and be able to create an understanding of their relative popularity over time. For the purposes of this study, I focused on the Tongrentang one because I just haven't had enough time to extract all the drugs from the rest of the Yao Mu, but it was clearly the most significant. And as I said, half of the drugs which contributed to the military by imperial control, even the Tongrentang speech. So just state the hypothesis straight out. Military formula distribution acted as a textual multiplier on military formulas relative to formulas in different. And I have this little thing right here, independent popularizers of medicine. That's really the question we're asking. Is this the reason why these medicines increase in popularity on different discursive levels? Because of these guys? Or is it because of the state? Or maybe a little bit of both, but so far we have tended to assume it's there. And I don't necessarily think we should automatically assume. So let's just go for it. Okay. So really what we're trying to do is compare the textual incidence of military formulas against control groups using open access to proprietary databases. And really the most significant one is the Zhongyi. This is a really, really great website. It has many different medical texts on it in web formatted form. I've gone through them and I have not necessarily verified, but I've kind of vetted just over 1,000 of them to make sure that they generally have the contents of the digitized text that they represent. And so far, they've been very reliable. Whenever I've cross-checked or cited the source against a manual text or a hard copy text, it generally works. And by my count, there's at least over 1,000 texts in this database, medical texts, which are relatively reliable. You can search it using a search tool. And basically, these texts represent most of, if not all, of the most mainstream medical texts in Chinese history. And you can search these drugs in these texts, and you can see whether they appear inside of a text over time. So from this, I created a series of I actually created a control group, and I created a series of variable groups. So the control group is a group which is designed. It is a group which is designed to test the behavior of drugs over time in Chinese history, particularly these chengyao, these chengyao with these names, these ontological schemes. And it became necessary to anchor this discussion in this basic understanding of how a drug behaves over time, which was very difficult. Because to my understanding, no one has ever created a global description of how most drugs in Chinese history behave in time and text, whether they increase, whether they decrease, whether they tend to disappear, etc. And so what I decided to do was use a series of painstaking hard searching combined with various logical assumptions to create a control group of 120 formulas, all originating from the Songjingyuan. Now, the formula groups are selected 30 apiece to control for time frame, bias in the classics, homophonic noise, and Pareto effects. And I can kind of go over that in the Q&A if you're interested. But it's basically to establish a baseline of the behavior of this over time, of these drugs over time. And you'll see what happened. Now, on top of that, once we have this control group established, we know what's normal, what's relatively normal for a formula over time, at least what we can posit as normal. Okay, we can then use these variable groups, Songjin Yuan origin military formulas. So take all of the formulas which I have as confirmed were distributed by the Qing to soldiers, and I basically just extract from them all of the ones which have an origin in a text from the Songjin Yuan. Now, why am I going over this Songjin Yuan? Why am I so obsessed with Songjin Yuan? Well, it's very important that in order to see the multiplier effect of military distribution or presence on a pharmaceutical catalog, such as the Tongrentang, in order to see those effects, you need to see its behavior over time. You need to see whether or not the shape of its textual incidence, the shape of its curve, increases over time, and whether it increases relative to the period before you're talking about, or decreases when you're not really talking about much of a multiplier effect right there. So it's very important to isolate drugs in a specific period where they have a lot in common with one another. And drugs that come from the Songjin Yuan originated from, they have a lot in common in that all three of these states were very institutionally medically aggressive, particularly the Song. So is the Jin, and so is the Yuan. They had very elaborated medical systems and medical welfare systems. They engaged in a lot of different print projects. This was a very interesting time in Chinese history for the state and medicine. And at the same time, a lot of the drugs that come from this period were acting in response to classical medicine. So getting a formula from this era, as opposed to perhaps the Han Dynasty, eliminates any possibility that people are just putting a drug on a catalog or something because it's been around since for 2,000 years, and so therefore it's obligatory to put it on. You can tease all those out. And you can also see its shape over time. So that's the reason why I choose these distribution curves. And I want to show you what I discovered. And it's all very complicated, but I can answer any questions. I'll take any critiques too. So the first one, Songjin Yuan origin primary control group. Okay, and so this is this is a lot of there's over 80 of the sorry, this is the 120 group, and you can see there's 120 different lines right here. And I wanted to explain something. I wanted to show something to you to make it all make sense. Basically, what I have discovered by doing these comparisons in these graphs over time is that more often than not, when you start at 950 to kind of capture the entire Song period and go all the way to nearly the end of the Qing and make kind of nice, neat 50-year increments, is that drugs have a tendency to remain flat for several centuries up to the end of the Song period. But this is probably almost certainly because of the number of texts which are pretty rich. And then, of course, you have a spike in the number of texts that occur in the Ming period. And then what's really fascinating to see is to see right when the Ming falls, the Qing and the Manchu conquest takes over, you see a drop in everything. And it's one of the most reliable things to watch these drugs just drop in the number of texts that they appear in. And then they all go back up again. And that's almost certainly because of the Manchu conquest. But this expansion in the Ming dynasty was almost certainly because of the expansion of printing. This collapse is almost certainly because of the conquest, and the expansion at the end of the Qing was because of the conquest. And so you have this double mountain kind of shape in nearly every single one of its lines. The question is what does it do with this double? And how does the mountain on the right compare to the mountain? You can do that by just making a simple little trend line. Okay. And basically what this means is very simple. If you are a chengyao or hangdi or however you need to define formula, and that formula, okay, if that formula begins in a text, you can find its initial occurrence in the Song period. More often than not, on average, by virtue of that fact alone, it will tend to increase the number of texts that appear given over time, all the way up to the beginning of the 20th century, by a relatively significant margin. By relatively significant degree. Not super significant, but relatively. And I think everybody can probably sort of see that in this simple map in my head, but it looks like these two are kind of equal. But in reality, there's a bit of an increase. And this is the average appearance. This is not absolute appearance, this is average appearance. So this is capturing the relative appearance of all of these formulas relative to the actual number of texts for each period. So this is the baseline of all drugs in Chinese history. Once in the Song period, you're gonna just kind of appear in this. So remember this 1 to 5. Okay, and all of a sudden we have the Tongrentang pharmacies. So you go to the Tongrentang Yamu and you found every single one of the drugs that you can find, or at least a control group of them. It's some cross section. I choose about 30, okay, which appear from the Song period. Now the Tongrentang was not completely original in everything that they did. None of these bulk pharmacies were. They took drugs that had long histories from state formularies in the Song, and they resold them and repackaged them as well. And so you can get those drugs from them and see the shape. And as you can see the stereotypical shape. Starts off right around here, and you have a double mountain. Now, what is the ultimate shape of this double mountain right here for the Tongrentang pharmacy? Is it going to be like this? We're going to see this diagonal increase. Is it going to continue? Most importantly, is it going to continue on its pre-conquest trend line after the recovery? What's interesting is you get, not really. That's very interesting. I find that absolutely fascinating. Now, first of all, we have to establish something. Take a look at the scale over on the left over there, highlighted. Okay, so the scale goes, it's down here for -2 for convenience, right? You go up to 0 to 16. Yes, any drug that appears on the Tongrentang pharmacy catalog and originates from the Song, it has a pretty significant textual appearance over time. And you can see it even in the scatter graph right here. It's just much higher than the others. So the Tongrentang definitely it's dealing with drugs which are more popular. The question is that by virtue of the fact that it appears on Tongrentang catalog, which started roughly at the end of the 17th century, and the pharmacy really got going and making its first catalog at the beginning of the 18th century. By virtue of the fact of it appearing on this, does it mean that it would outcompete its performance from the main period? And as you can see, not really. There is a trend line going upward, but the shape of the curve doesn't necessarily suggest that the Tongrentang has a significant multiplier effect on its drugs that it acquired from previous times. I find that very interesting because it's certainly not what you would expect. But you do get a trend line upward. You do get a trend line upward if you base it in. Now, what about this? Take all the drugs that the Qing military distributed to its soldiers. Well, in terms of imperial conferral, all of these chengyao, these different names, and there's several of them right here. And you take out all the ones that come from the Song, which is a lot. It's like 74 of the 94 that. It's a lot of them. They really chose drugs that had a long history. And you get this scatter graph right here, and I think most people can see where this is probably going. This side just looks to be going in different directions than where it was before. And if you thought that, you would be wrong. After the collapse of the Ming, you have the dip as you would expect it, and then it just recovers and it just reaches heights that it just simply did not reach to the Tongrentang, and it's basically the same beginning. It outperforms its main performance, and gets back on track, and it comes from the same starting point. And so military distribution is dealing with drugs. It's dealing with drugs really that had a pretty significant expansion effect on the Qing dynasty. Being associated with military distribution means that you were really carrying in a lot of medical weight as a drug. But the problem was, as I said, the Qing distributed a lot of drugs that were on the Tongrentang catalog. They were on that catalog, so we got to tease that out. So that's what I do. Okay, I take drugs that were not on the Tongrentang catalog, okay, but were distributed to the Qing military, and I also take drugs that were on the Tongrentang catalog and also just distributed by the Qing military. Okay. And as you can see, even when you remove the Tongrentang catalog from a military formula's advantages, being associated with military drug distribution still puts it on a steeper distribution curve than the Qing military formulas that did come from the Tongrentang. Okay, you get a +3 text, you get a multiplier of 3 texts. At least it seems that way. And what's really interesting to this is when you keep this in mind, when you think of that, and you go to this right here, it makes you think, was this graph, are these graphs going up and reaching these heights right here because the drugs were on the Tongrentang catalog, or is it the opposite? It's because they were distributed by the military. And I find that a very compelling question. Makes sense. Okay. So one of the ways that we can here, yeah, these kinds of relationships are most productively analyzed among those drugs which were completely or nearly invisible in mainstream medical literature, and yet still popular at the practical literate level, were used by the Qing court, and were or were not in the Tongrentang catalog as a variant. If these drugs achieve a concordance between their use at these various levels, that is, at every level when they're being used at court, on the Tongrentang catalog, or in level has to be explained in terms independently of its popularity of the place, as the two discourses, as you will see, can operate quite independently. I'm going to focus on 6 drugs right here. That'll round this out. I chose them for very specific reasons. We're going to end on this Qianlong one. It's a very special drug. And a couple of them are very significant in that um, they, uh, they don't appear in the Tongrentang catalog, and at the same time they do appear in the info collection. Or in the case of a Heniantang one, just like all of these have it in common that they do not appear in mainstream medical literature. So if you put them through a database such as Dongyijicheng, or even if you go through Jibengujiku, you hit the really big databases, you will find that these just simply do not have a significant presence, or they are absolutely invisible. Yet here you go, check this out. An invisible drug over time, very popular, very popular. So the discourse is really and very easily discarded. Find that really very interesting. We can have a look at Wujisan. Okay, and this is a drug that achieves maximum concordance. Again, nobody ever wrote about this drug. I can't ever find a text where anybody actually wrote anything about this drug. It was published. But nonetheless, they used it at court a lot. And it was used in the case of an imperial concubine named Dunfei. Obviously, it's concubine, but experiences sinking cold in her stomach with slight pain. Okay, and then at the same time, one of the very interesting things about this drug is that it is taken in conjunction with these 3 drugs right here almost always. Now, where am I getting my court records from? One of the interesting things, one of the advantages now of doing medical history on the Qing is that you can take advantage of the fact that the scholar Chen Ji has done such an enormous amount of archival work on Qing court medicine and court cases and see the different drug uses of court in his collections as well. And you can get an idea of the patterns of how these were used. And whenever this drug is used, it's almost always periods, which are generally stomach prevention. So we have sinking cold in our stomach, and you have the twin prevention. And of course, when you look on the Tongrentang catalog from 1889, this drug is used for external affliction by wind, cold, navel, and abdominal pain. There's just a significant concordance from all the way from the 18th century all the way to the end of the Guangxu period. And then, of course, if you take a look at the Unschul collection, this is where we put on the Unschul. If you took it 8535, I just used the catalog. But the name of it is 100, but I don't always do it. It just copies the Tongrentang. So we have maximum concordance. And again, this drug appears in virtually no mainstream texts of any. So we are achieving maximum concordance between court use all the way at the top and all the way down, and all the way down into multiple texts of this, all the way down at the in the Republican period at the level of the semi-literate physician. Okay, even though they can't read about them in any major text. That is really, really quite fascinating. Okay, and so even the ingredients are common. You look at, are there original documents and that's what the text, you'll discover that there is very serious, they're very real ingredients. So it's the same ingredient, similar ingredients, almost exact same application. State sector, bulk pharmaceutical market, private application, both. And so that's an example of that, right? And given this graph, we have to ask ourselves, why? Why does that concordance exist? Is it because it would appear on the Tongrentang catalog? And is it because it was distributed by bulk pharmaceutical? Or was it because it was distributed by the state? Or both? Both. I think that it's a much more complex relationship. This is another one right here, Genie 221. This is invisible in major medical literature. You just can't find it. This thing is very difficult to find. It was extremely commonly used. Again, taken concurrently with these drugs right here. I mean, it just constantly appears with these two. And all of them are designed to dispel summer heat, which is shit right there. And of course, you can find it in initial documents, 8040, 4954. There's no information on application, but you get identical ingredients in here. But in this right here, you get in this situation, you have for men and women when in the summertime when they encounter a summer heat and it is cold in the summertime, that is when you are coming in contact with a qi that is atypical for that period, you end up getting these kind of evils, these kind of damages that result from it. It's also wind damage and everything. And this document says this. And if you take a look at Chen Keji's court reconstruction of this formula, as well as other scholars' reconstruction of this formula, it identifies precisely. And so the question then becomes, where did this document get this information? Because there was no text that they could have read. That's, yeah. And at the same time, you can look at the Tongrentang and it does the same thing, right? So perhaps you have this concordance where they just looked at the Tongrentang, okay, and they just copied it. And that's always the temptation, is to believe that. Again, Huanglian Shangting One, invisible medical literature, regular court use, never taken concurrently. Okay. It's used for clearing heat masses, heat matches in the triple burner. Okay, and you get the same thing in the uncial collections. Same thing in the uncial collections. Okay. Now we have a drug with no court use. The court never used this drug right here. It is included in the Tongrentang Yalmu, okay? And it has ingredients overlap with multiple uncial documents, okay? And it achieves concordance with bulk pharmacy, so it's just basically copying the Tongrentang Yalmu. Okay? So it looks like we are having a situation where these different kinds of physicians are just copying what the Tongrentang Yalmu says. It says this right here. And then we start looking at drugs like this. There's no use of court, and this is also not on the Tongrentang Yalmu. Okay, so this person can't just go to the Tongrentang Yalmu and look at that. Okay, two identical documents. Lots of communication. Just no. And so what I suspect is that when you have these situations where these drugs are used at court and they are distributed by the military, all of these are military drugs. Okay, but they're not on these bulk pharmaceutical catalogs. We could always just say, oh, they got it from another catalog. Or we could think that perhaps this drug became popular because it was distributed to soldiers and they used it. And information descended from the top of the state. And that is not really out of the question because the higher echelons of the state. But there were various different relationships. So there are significant connections between these pharmacies and the top of use. And without any popular medical literature to look at, or at least mainstream literature to look at, I speculate that one of the reasons why knowledge of this is descending is because the drugs themselves and physicians who are sent to use them are distributed to these millions of soldiers over the Qing Dynasty. And all of this comes to a head with Qianlong, the wonder drug. And then after this, I'll wrap up. But Qianlong was the most commonly appearing formula circulating through the Qing civil and military bureaucracy. It was, in fact, very possibly the most common substance which was circulated through the Qing state for its entire history. Though it was enormously popular at court from the early 18th century, Qianlong was nigh invisible in Qing mainstream and medical literature. A few modern attempts to reconstruct its use of court for internal medical records, where it generally treats a variety of internal disorders such as pains or discomfort in the stomach, heart, or chest. There have been attempts to do that. However, outside of court, it took on a wide variety of incompatible applications. It was sent to the Manchu General Fukangan in the Miao campaigns in 1790 to help cure some of these. In Nepal in 1793, 1,000 soldiers received the drug to combat miasmas. In 1729, an official received it for exposure to cold pathogen, probably a febrile disease. In 1722, Emperor Yongzheng himself was straight to the point. He called it a wonder drug. And this was even more complicated in the case in 1759, when in Xinjiang, a memorial for the Manchu General Zhao Hui thanked the emperor for a conferral containing Qianlong and Tongrentang, both explicitly labeled such medicines which cure blade and firearm wounds. I can only find very limited evidence within any state or private sources suggesting Qianlong was used to treat wounds, especially ones identified so specifically. The only widely known text Qianlong appears in is Ma Wenger's 1892 collection on external medicine, which omits its application, and it's generally referring to talking about curing abscess. So with this drug, I kind of make my last case. I think the fact that Qianlong was so heavily distributed, and it was very, very heavily distributed in China. If you go to the First Historical Archives of China's website and use within a single keyword hit for its holding, Qianlong appears thousands of times. It's in Manchu documents. They really, really, it really spiked in terms of its use during the Emperor Yongzheng. He was really obsessed with this drug. But I think really what's going on is that the fact that it was so heavily distributed, it never seemed to take hold in medical literature, nor in practical literature. There's only one unshelled entry for this drug, even though it was heavily circulated in this. One entry, and that's it. Okay, maybe explained by the lack of standardization which was ascribed to it. I think that what is really happening right here, and this is my final hypothesis, it's kind of a preliminary, was that what accounted for these kinds of graphs, what accounted for this kind of increase over time, is the standardization that was imposed to these drugs through either the use of catalogs, their use or their use in the military. But who ultimately sets the tone for how a drug is used when it is distributed in the military, but there is no book which will tell you how to use it? Well, I think that starts up at the top of the court use. So when you have this concordance between court, military, and this private use, I think what you have right there is a kind of feedback loop, and it resuscitates and rehabilitates a relationship the Qing government had to the medical sector that I think many scholars have suggested it was. And that is the end of my presentation, and I thank you very much for listening.